I always thought humiliation had a sound. Maybe the crack of laughter in a crowded room, or the soft scrape of a chair moving away from a table as someone decides you're not worth staying for. That night, I learned it's quieter than that. It's the sound of a wine glass half full and untouched, the soft rustle of a napkin folding in on itself, and the delicate clink of a $5 bill sliding across white linen like a final insult dressed as courtesy. He was late, of course. Not fashionably, not apologetically, just late. 35 minutes of me pretending to check my phone, pretending not to notice the pitying glances of the waitstaff who were starting to realize I'd been stood up. When he finally arrived, it was with that swaggering air of someone who'd already decided the world owed him for showing up. His name was Dylan, my friend's perfect match for me, and he looked like every bad decision I'd ever promised myself I wouldn't make again. Expensive watch, cologne that tried too hard, smile that didn't reach his eyes. He didn't even apologize. Just dropped into the chair across from me, flashed a grin that probably worked on women who didn't know better, and said, "You look practical." Practical. As if I were a piece of furniture he might consider purchasing if it matched his aesthetic. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because if I didn't, I might have thrown my water in his face. I should have known right then to get up, but there's a kind of stubborn dignity that keeps you sitting when pride tells you to stand, and I wasn't ready to give the restaurant audience the satisfaction of watching me walk out alone. So I smiled back, the kind of brittle smile that hurts the cheeks, and told him I was glad he made it. He didn't ask what I did for work, or where I grew up, or even what my favorite drink was. He just talked. About himself, of course. About his crypto portfolio, his gym routine, the new Tesla he didn't technically own, but made payments on like a badge of superiority. I nodded at all the right places, murmured polite interest, and wondered if maybe my friend had secretly hated me this whole time. Somewhere around his story about manifesting wealth, I felt my soul detach and drift toward the ceiling, hovering there in detached observation of the pathetic tableau below. Me, trying not to roll my eyes. Him, scrolling through his phone mid-conversation. The waiter, looking at me with quiet pity. I started to count the ceiling lights to keep from losing my patience entirely. And then, the moment that would etch itself into memory, he leaned back, checked his watch with theatrical boredom, and sighed. "Listen," he said, as if he were breaking some tragic news. "You seem nice, but I think we both know this isn't it." Before I could even process what it was, he stood up, grabbed his coat, and tossed a $5 bill onto the table. "That should cover your drink," he said, smiling that smug, careless smile. "No hard feelings, yeah?" And then he walked away. $5, 5 crumpled dollars on a starched white tablecloth between half-eaten breadsticks and the ruins of my self-respect. The waiter froze mid-step, his eyes darting between the bill and my face, as if unsure whether to comfort me or clear the evidence of my public rejection. I wanted to laugh, to cry, to shout something clever and cutting after him. But all I did was sit there, numb, until the sound of his footsteps disappeared into the murmur of the restaurant. I could feel the room watching me. Pity from some tables, amusement from others. I reached for the $5, smoothed it out between trembling fingers, and placed it back where it had fallen, because somehow even touching it made the whole thing feel too real. My cheeks burned, my throat tight, and I could almost hear my mother's voice whispering, "You shouldn't have gone on a blind date, sweetheart. People show you who they are when they think you'll forgive them for it." That's when I felt it. The weight of a stare. It wasn't curious or pitying. It was heavier, more deliberate, like being studied under glass. My eyes flicked up, sweeping the room, and there he was. A man sitting alone at the corner table near the window. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a suit so perfectly tailored it looked like it had been sewn directly onto his body. He was watching me. Not pretending to, not glancing casually, but watching, with the kind of focus that made air feel thicker, like gravity had shifted just slightly around us. His hair was dark, slicked back but not overly polished, and there was a faint scar running along his jawline that caught the light when he moved. He didn't smile, didn't look away, just held my gaze, calm, unreadable, assessing. I told myself to look down, to grab my bag, to get out before the embarrassment consumed me whole. But something in his stare pinned me there, like he was silently daring me to move first. And then, for just a second, he tilted his head, the faintest curve of something that wasn't quite a smile, more like recognition or approval. It made my stomach twist. I finally broke the stare, muttered something to the waiter about adding it to my card, and left the $5 where it was. As I stood, I could feel his eyes following me. Not in a predatory way exactly, but with an intensity that made me self-conscious in a way I'd never been before. When I stepped outside, the cold night air hit like a slap, clearing the fog of humiliation just enough for anger to set in. I pulled my coat tighter, exhaled, and laughed bitterly. $5, that was the price of my evening, maybe the price of my pride. The restaurant door opened behind me, and for a fleeting second I thought maybe Dylan had come back to apologize, to make it right, to say something that would make this night a little less humiliating. But it wasn't him. It was the man from the corner table. He paused at the door, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the street like someone used to danger. When his gaze brushed mine again, there was no mistaking it. Deliberate, sharp, knowing. He didn't approach, didn't speak, just watched as I walked away, my heels clicking against the pavement, each step a little faster than the last. I didn't look back, but I could feel it. That strange, electric awareness that you're not just being seen, but marked. The kind of attention that lingers long after it should fade, threading itself into your mind like smoke. I told myself it was just my imagination, that he was probably no one, just another stranger with a sharp suit and sharper eyes. But when I reached my apartment that night, there was a black car parked across the street, engine idling, lights off. I hesitated at the door, my keys trembling in my hand, and for a heartbeat I thought I saw movement in the car, the faint silhouette of a man leaning back, watching. I shook it off, told myself I was being paranoid, told myself it was nothing. But as I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, my heart still racing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that somehow, in that small act of humiliation, in that $5 moment of defeat, I had been noticed by someone who didn't know the meaning of coincidence. And the next morning, when I opened my door and found a single black rose lying on the welcome mat, tied with a silk ribbon, no note, just silence, I realized that whatever had started in that restaurant wasn't over. It was just beginning. When I opened my door that morning and saw the black rose lying there like a secret no one had dared to whisper aloud, my first thought wasn't fear. It was disbelief. The kind that steals the air from your lungs because you know deep down that something extraordinary, something not meant for your ordinary life, has just stepped over the threshold. I stared at it for a long time, the petals so dark they almost shimmered blue under the pale morning light, the ribbon a deep shade of red that looked too deliberate, too intimate, too much like a signature written in silk. There was no card, no name, no explanation, just that single rose resting like a confession I hadn't been meant to find. I stood there, barefoot on the cool floor, robe hanging loosely from one shoulder, the chill creeping into my skin as I tried to make sense of the absurdity of it. No one I knew would send something like that. Not after a humiliating blind date. Not after the disaster I was still trying to laugh off to my reflection in the mirror. And yet there it was. quiet and menacing and beautiful, as if someone had watched me walk home, seen my embarrassment burn under the streetlights, and decided that my story wasn't finished. I didn't touch it at first. I just looked at it the way you might look at a sleeping animal you're not sure is safe to wake. When I finally bent down and picked it up, I noticed something strange. There was the faintest trace of cologne on the ribbon. Masculine, smoky, expensive. The kind of scent that clings to memory even when you try to scrub it away. It hit me then. The image of the man from the restaurant. The one sitting in the shadows, his gaze cutting through me like he'd been watching a scene he didn't plan to interrupt, but couldn't look away from either. I could still see the way he'd tilted his head, the small movement that had felt so intentional, as if he'd been memorizing me. The thought that he might somehow be connected to this rose sent a tremor down my spine, half fear, half thrill. I placed the rose in a glass of water, though I wasn't sure why. Habit, maybe, or denial. Maybe I wanted proof that it was real, that it would still be there tomorrow morning and not dissolve like a dream. I went about my day pretending nothing had changed, though the world seemed to hum differently, like I'd stepped through a door I hadn't realized was open. At work, the chatter of my co-workers felt distant, their laughter tinny and shallow, and I found myself glancing at the windows as if the dark glass might be watching me back. By lunchtime, I'd almost convinced myself I was overreacting, that maybe the rose was some weird prank or a mix-up, that maybe the florist had delivered it to the wrong apartment. But when I checked my phone during my break, there was a message from an unknown number. No words, no emojis, no context. Just a single photograph. It was of me, from the night before, walking away from the restaurant, head bowed, arms crossed, with the streetlights painting my shadow long and lonely across the pavement. No caption. No sender name. Just that image. For a long minute, I couldn't breathe. My fingers trembled so hard I almost dropped my phone. The photo wasn't one I'd taken, obviously. Someone else had been there. Someone who had followed me, close enough to capture the exact moment I'd turned the corner. I wanted to tell myself it was Dylan, some cruel continuation of the joke. But the precision of it, the timing, the composition, felt too deliberate. Dylan wasn't that clever. Whoever this was, they had been watching with intent. That night, I double-locked my door, drew the curtains, and left a light on in the living room. I tried to sleep, but every sound made my heart race. The groan of the building, the hiss of passing cars, even the wind against the window pane sounded like footsteps. Sometime around 3 a.m., I heard an engine start outside, low and deep, and I couldn't resist. I slipped to the window and peeked through the narrow gap between the curtains. The same black car from the night before was idling across the street, headlights off, just a shadow with the faint glint of chrome beneath the streetlight. I couldn't see inside, but I didn't need to. I knew he was there, watching. The next morning, there was no rose, no message, nothing but silence, and in that silence, an ache I couldn't explain. It should have been relief, but it wasn't. It was disappointment, raw and shameful. I didn't want to admit that part of me missed the attention, missed feeling seen, even if it was dangerous. Because somewhere between humiliation and curiosity, something inside me had awakened. Something I didn't know I'd been starving for. 3 days passed, no messages, no roses, no cars. I started to believe maybe it was really over, that I'd invented the intensity of it, exaggerated the whole thing into some twisted fantasy to make my heartbreak seem more cinematic than pathetic. But on the 4th day, as I was leaving work, I saw him again. He was standing across the street from my office, leaning casually against a lamppost, dark coat buttoned up, gloves on, a presence that seemed to command the space around him like gravity itself bent slightly in his favor. The moment our eyes met, my heart stuttered. It wasn't the wide-eyed recognition of a stranger. It was the silent acknowledgement between two people who had already shared something, even if that something was just a gaze across a crowded room. He didn't move toward me, didn't call out, just watched. Expression unreadable, eyes like storm clouds holding too much meaning. And then, without a word, he turned and got into a car that appeared out of nowhere, black and sleek, the same one I'd seen outside my apartment. And as it pulled away, I noticed a small envelope slip from the passenger window, fluttering onto the sidewalk like a fallen leaf. My legs moved before my mind caught up. I crossed the street, picked it up. Inside, there was a folded note written in elegant, deliberate handwriting. No one walks away from you like that. Not again. That was all it said. No signature, no explanation. I read it over and over, tracing the letters like I might find fingerprints in the ink, my pulse thrumming louder with each repetition. It was absurd, impossible, invasive. And yet, God help me. I felt something stir in my chest that wasn't fear. It was something darker, something that felt like recognition, as if my soul had been waiting for someone to say those exact words without ever knowing why. That night, I didn't lock my door right away. I sat by the window, staring out into the darkness, waiting for headlights that didn't come. Every sound outside, the faint hum of a car, the echo of distant footsteps, sent my pulse racing. I kept the note on my coffee table, next to the wilted black rose, the two objects glowing under the lamplight like omens. When I finally drifted into a restless sleep, I dreamed of the man from the restaurant, the way his gaze had burned through the space between us, the way the scar along his jaw had caught the light like a promise. In the dream, he wasn't sitting in the shadows anymore. He was walking toward me, eyes cold and beautiful, holding out that same black rose as if offering a choice I didn't yet understand. And when I woke, there was a sound, a soft knock on my door, so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate. I froze, every nerve in my body alive and electric. The clock on my nightstand read 2:17 a.m. The city outside was quiet, asleep, unknowing. I held my breath, waiting, praying the sound wouldn't come again. And then it did. 3 knocks. The same rhythm, the same certainty. I didn't move, I didn't answer. But when I finally gathered the courage to look through the peephole, my blood ran cold. There was no one there. Only another black rose, this one fresh, dew still clinging to the petals, resting against my door. And tucked beneath it, a white card with 4 simple words, handwritten in the same elegant ink. We need to talk. When I woke the next morning, the rose was gone. For a moment, in that thin veil between dreaming and waking, I thought I'd imagined it all. The knock, the soft scrape of something sliding against my door, the strange ache that had followed me into sleep. But when I checked, the faint outline of water where the dew had melted was still there. A fragile ring on the tile like proof that the night had indeed happened, even if the evidence had been quietly erased. Whoever he was, he'd been close enough to touch my door, close enough to hear me breathing on the other side, and yet careful enough to leave no trace except for the echo he'd carved into my thoughts. I told myself I should call someone, the police maybe, or my building manager, or my friend Mia, who'd set up that wretched date in the first place. But I didn't. I made coffee instead. The kind of ritual movement that fills the silence with something familiar. Something safe. The air smelled of burnt espresso and faint roses, a combination that shouldn't have made sense but somehow did. The bitterness of one wrapping around the sweetness of the other, until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. That's how it felt thinking about him. This faceless man who'd stepped out of the dark corners of a restaurant and into my life with a black rose and a gaze that still lingered behind my eyelids. The day unfolded with the strange unreality that comes when your world is slightly tilted and you're pretending it isn't. I went to work, smiled at people, replied to emails I didn't read. planned events for people whose lives seemed so pristine compared to mine. Yet underneath it all, there was a hum, low and constant, like a heartbeat just under the surface. I caught myself glancing at every dark car that passed, searching for familiar eyes behind tinted glass, half hoping, half fearing I'd see him again. It was madness, I knew that. But the kind of madness that whispers instead of screams. The kind that makes you ache rather than panic. It wasn't until late afternoon that something shifted again, and when it did, it felt almost ordinary. The receptionist walked over to my desk, smiling her polite, oblivious smile, holding out a small white envelope with my name written across it, in that same elegant, deliberate handwriting I'd seen on the note before. She said it had been delivered by courier, that there was no return address, no sender's name, just Lena Moretti, in bold ink that looked almost too personal to be professional. I took it, my pulse pounding in my ears, the edges of the paper biting softly into my fingers. Inside, there was a single card, ivory, thick, expensive. It smelled faintly of smoke and something masculine. The words were few but exact. You left something behind. Friday night, 8 p.m., the Grand Mayfair, table 12, no signature, no clue, just that. For a long time I stared at it, the black ink seeming to sink deeper into the page the longer I looked. The Grand Mayfair was one of the most exclusive hotels in the city, the kind of place that didn't host simple dinners, but orchestrated experiences. I'd planned events there before. I knew the kind of men who booked those tables. Men with money, power, secrets. Men who owned rooms without ever signing papers for them. Men like the one from the restaurant. I told myself I wouldn't go, that I wasn't that naive, that no woman with a sense of self-preservation would walk willingly into a situation so obviously dangerous. But even as I said it to myself, I knew I was lying. Because curiosity is a quiet addiction, and I had already taken the first dose. By the time Friday came, I had rehearsed a dozen versions of how the evening might unfold, each one ending with me walking away unscathed, unshaken, unchanged. But beneath the rationalizations, something deeper throbbed. A hunger I didn't want to name. An unspoken desire to be seen again by the man who had watched me when everyone else had laughed or pitied. When I arrived at the Grand Mayfair, the doorman greeted me by name. That should have been my first warning. The lobby was golden light and hushed conversation. Marble floors that echoed softly under my heels. A pianist playing something melancholy in the corner that matched the rhythm of my heart. I told the hostess I was meeting someone at table 12, and she didn't even ask for a name. Just smiled that too knowing smile and led me through the maze of crystal chandeliers and velvet curtains to a secluded alcove near the window, where the city glowed like a reflection of the stars. He was already there. He rose when I approached, tall and composed, the world narrowing to the few feet of space between us. Seeing him in full light for the first time was like being struck. Not because he was conventionally beautiful, though he was in that severe, unsettling way that belongs to men who've lived too long in shadow, but because he looked like someone who didn't belong to this century. There was something timeless in the way he carried himself, deliberate, unhurried, every movement weighted with quiet power. His suit was black, tailored with precision, his shirt collar open just enough to reveal a hint of the chain that rested against his throat. That scar along his jaw looked sharper now, a silver crescent against the warm tone of his skin. His eyes, gray with flecks of something stormy, met mine and didn't let go. "Lena," he said, his voice low, smooth with an accent that brushed softly against the edges of his words like smoke curling around a flame. "You came." I didn't answer right away. My pulse was wild, but my voice came steady. "You didn't give me much of a choice." He smiled, barely. "There's always a choice, but curiosity can be persuasive." He gestured for me to sit. I did, though every instinct screamed that I was walking a knife's edge. The air between us was charged, not loud but alive, filled with all the words neither of us had said yet. He studied me with quiet intensity, his gaze dipping once to the small tremor of my hand before returning to my face. "I wanted to see you again," he said simply, like it was the most natural statement in the world. "That night, you didn't belong in that scene. You looked like someone trying to disappear while everyone else was pretending to matter." I didn't know what to say to that. It was both a compliment and an accusation, both too intimate and too precise. "You were watching," I said finally. It came out more breath than voice. He leaned back slightly, the faintest glint of amusement in his eyes. "I was," he said. "I noticed things worth noticing. You were unexpected." He didn't tell me his name right away, not until halfway through the meal, which, for the record, I barely touched. When he finally did, it rolled off his tongue like a secret not meant for everyone to hear. "Damien," he said. "Damien Vasilyev." The name landed heavy, like thunder on still air. I'd heard it before, whispered in the background of conversations I wasn't meant to overhear, attached to stories that didn't make it to the newspapers because the people who could tell them didn't live long enough. The kind of name that made people lower their voices and cross themselves without realizing it. The Ghost King. The man who ruled half the city from the shadows. And there he was, sitting across from me, watching me like I was something fragile and fascinating all at once. I should have run. I didn't. Instead, I asked, "Why me?" He smiled, slow and dangerous, the kind of smile that promised answers, but only if you were willing to pay for them. "Because," he said, "you looked at me like you weren't afraid. Even when you should have been." The conversation that followed blurred at the edges. Questions that were really confessions. Truths that sounded like lies. He spoke of art and loyalty, of how some debts are written in blood and others in silence. I listened, mesmerized, until he finally said something that made my breath catch. "I protect what interests me, Lena, even if it doesn't yet know it needs protection." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise, one I didn't know how to refuse. When dinner ended, he stood and offered his hand. I hesitated only a heartbeat before taking it, the warmth of his skin against mine sending a pulse through me that felt dangerously like surrender. He leaned close, his breath brushing my ear. "This isn't our last dinner," he murmured, "but it could be your last chance to walk away." And when I finally stepped out into the night, heart racing, I realized two things at once. First, that I had no intention of walking away, and second, that his black car was already waiting by the curb, engine running, driver unseen, like the next move in a game I didn't know I was playing. And as I climbed in, curiosity outweighing fear, I caught his reflection in the glass, that same faint smile, half shadow, half devotion, and I knew, with a clarity that felt almost like prophecy, that I'd just accepted an invitation into a world I wouldn't be able to leave. The night after that dinner at the Grand Mayfair has stayed with me in fragments, like pieces of a dream that refuses to fade even when reality demands its place again. And though I told myself I would not think of him, not allow that low, velvet voice or that piercing, steady gaze to haunt the corners of my thoughts, I found that everything in me had shifted, subtly, irreversibly, like a compass needle drawn toward a magnetic field it cannot resist. I remember the car ride home, the city streaming past like veins of light through darkness, and how he sat across from me in the back seat, not speaking, not touching, but present in a way that made every nerve in my body aware of him, as though silence itself had been tuned to his frequency. The air between us was charged, dense with something unspoken, and even though his gaze wasn't on me directly, I could feel it. The weight of it resting on the space where my pulse fluttered just beneath my collarbone. A silent claim, a question, a warning all at once. When we stopped in front of my building, he leaned forward slightly, his hand resting on his knee, and said very quietly, "You don't have to thank me." And I stupidly asked, "For what?" He looked at me then, really looked, with those cold, knowing eyes that seemed to carry centuries of quiet violence, and said, "For seeing you when no one else did." That should have been my moment to leave, to walk out, to close my door on this strange, dark man who spoke in riddles and promises. But instead, I lingered, caught in that gaze, suspended in a silence that felt heavier than any noise. He smiled then, faintly, as if he could read every unspoken thought running wild in me. And before I could respond, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small black card, setting it gently on the seat between us. "When you're ready," he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to hum against the air, "call this number. I want to show you something. My world as it is. No illusions, no masks. 1 week, no lies." I didn't take it right away. My fingers hovered over it, the way you might hover over something dangerous that burns even before you touch it. He didn't push, didn't coax, just waited, as though patience were another weapon he'd mastered. "Why me?" I asked softly, almost to myself. But he answered anyway. "Because you're not pretending," he said. "Everyone else does." Then he nodded once to the driver, and the car pulled away, leaving me standing on the curb with that small black card burning a hole in my hand, my reflection glimmering faintly in the tinted window as he vanished into the night. The next few days unfolded in a blur of disquiet. The card sat on my kitchen counter like a dare I couldn't throw away. It was unmarked, no logo, just a number embossed in silver so faint it caught the light only when you tilted it the right way. I found myself circling it, literally sometimes, as though distance could protect me from the pull of it. I worked, I laughed when I needed to, I went out for drinks with Mia, and pretended I wasn't listening for a certain voice behind me. I told myself that I'd imagined the intensity of him, that men like Damien belonged in whispered stories, not in the fragile fabric of my very normal life. But every night I would lie in bed and replay that dinner. The way he spoke with such deliberate calm, like every word had been chosen in advance. The way his fingers had brushed the rim of his glass, slow, unhurried, and yet every motion had felt like a threat and a promise intertwined. I remembered his scent, cedar, smoke, something faintly metallic, and how it lingered even when I closed my eyes. By the third night, I couldn't take it anymore. I picked up the card, turned it over, and dialed the number before I could talk myself out of it. It rang once, twice, and then his voice came through, deep and controlled, and so familiar it made my breath catch. "I was wondering when curiosity would win," he said. I should have hung up. I didn't. "You said 1 week," I murmured. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, "you come with me. You see what I see, hear what I hear. You get to decide whether you want to keep pretending that your world is enough." "And if I say no?" I asked, though my voice already trembled with the truth that I wouldn't. He was silent for a long moment before answering. "Then I'll forget your name, and you'll go back to being invisible." Something in that sentence, cruel and tender all at once, tore through me. I didn't realize I was shaking until I heard myself whisper, "When?" "Tomorrow," he said. "I'll send a car." And then the line went dead. The following day was unbearable in its normalcy. Sunlight spilling through the windows, the clatter of coffee cups, the drone of city life that suddenly felt too bright, too false. I dressed carefully that morning, though I told myself I wasn't doing it for him. Black jeans, a silk blouse, hair down. I looked like someone trying to seem unaffected, but my pulse betrayed me with every breath. At exactly 6 o'clock, a black car appeared outside my building. The same one, sleek and silent as a shadow. A man in a suit I didn't recognize stepped out, opened the door, and said, "Mr. Vasilyev is waiting." His tone wasn't unkind, but it carried the kind of authority that left no room for hesitation. The drive took us far beyond the city center, past the glittering skyline into a quieter district, where the buildings grew taller, older, more secluded. When the car finally stopped, I realized we were outside an estate. No, not just a home, but something much larger. A mansion of pale stone surrounded by wrought iron gates and dense gardens, the kind of place that looked timeless, as though it had been there long before anyone had dared to build a city around it. The doors opened before I even stepped out, and there he was, Damien, standing at the top of the steps, hands in his pockets, the faintest smile curling his mouth as if he'd been expecting me for far longer than a day. "You came," he said again, those same words from before, though this time they sounded less like an observation and more like possession. I said I would. "Yes," he said, his gaze dragging over me slowly, deliberately. "But I didn't think you'd come alone." "I don't scare that easily," I lied. He stepped closer, his presence swallowing the distance between us. "You should," he said quietly, not unkindly, "but I'm glad you don't." The evening blurred into something unreal after that. Marble halls lit by candlelight, music drifting faintly from another room, the low murmur of voices that stopped when he entered. He showed me everything as if offering proof of who he was, his world, his empire, his control. Men greeted him with a mixture of reverence and fear. Women looked away when he passed. And through it all, he kept glancing at me, a small, knowing curve to his lips, as if I were some secret he was proud to have uncovered. At dinner, he finally leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, eyes locked to mine. "You could leave right now," he said. "Walk out that door, forget all this. But if you stay—" He paused, his voice lowering. "You'll have to understand something. I don't offer twice." I swallowed hard. "Offer what?" He smiled, but it wasn't gentle. "Protection, power, truth. A week to see the world through my eyes. After that, you'll either never want to leave or you'll wish you'd never come." I didn't answer. Couldn't. Not with his gaze holding mine like a hand around my throat. Somewhere deep inside, I knew that whatever choice I made tonight would change everything. That crossing this line meant surrendering something I might never get back. And yet, as the clock ticked in the silence between us, I heard myself whisper, "Then show me." His smile deepened, slow, dark, inevitable. And as he rose and held out his hand, the lights dimmed slightly, the music shifted, and I knew, with a strange calm that both thrilled and terrified me, that I had just accepted an invitation into a world where there would be no turning back. I learned that fear doesn't always arrive with warning. Sometimes it comes softly, disguised as an ordinary night, wrapped in the kind of stillness that makes you believe the world has decided to be kind for once, that maybe the chaos has passed you by. That's how it was the evening everything changed. The night I stopped pretending that Damien Vasilyev was simply a man with secrets, and began to understand that his world didn't just exist in shadows, it ruled them. It had been 2 days since I'd first stepped through the iron gates of his mansion. 2 days of being led through hallways lined with portraits of men whose eyes all seemed to follow me. 2 days of dinners where power tasted like expensive wine, and danger hung in the air like incense. I told myself I was only there to see, to understand, to satisfy the curiosity that had burned through my better judgment. But curiosity has a way of turning to attachment, and attachment to something far more dangerous. Because by then, I'd started to memorize the way he spoke, the way his voice would dip slightly when he said my name, the way he never seemed surprised by anything, yet always watched as though he expected the world to misbehave. That night, he wasn't there. He had left early, taking a call that sounded too serious for interruption. He told me to stay inside, to enjoy the quiet, and there was a tone in his voice that almost sounded like concern, though I had yet to decide whether that emotion belonged to him. The house was too large for one person, its silence echoing back at me like an accusation. I wandered through it restlessly, my bare feet brushing against cold marble floors, my fingertips grazing velvet drapes and the edges of gilded frames, wondering how many stories had been buried in this place, how many ghosts had learned to keep quiet here. I should have gone to bed. Instead, I found myself drawn to the balcony overlooking the gardens, sprawling, immaculate, eerily symmetrical under the wash of moonlight. It was beautiful, but it didn't feel peaceful. Nothing about Damien's world did. Even beauty here had sharp edges. I don't know how long I stood there, lost in the pull of my own thoughts, when I noticed it. Movement near the gates. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. Shifting shadow, maybe one of his guards making their rounds. But then the sound came, soft but distinct. The snap of a branch, the crunch of gravel under hurried footsteps. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was nothing, that the estate was guarded, that no one could just walk in uninvited. But before I could convince myself, I saw him. A man dressed in black, face half hidden by a hood, slipping between the hedges with a kind of desperate stealth that made my blood run cold. I turned to retreat, to find one of Damien's men, but the door behind me creaked, and before I could even scream, another hand, rough, gloved, closed over my mouth. My body went rigid, my breath trapped in my chest. The man smelled of sweat and metal, and when he spoke, his voice was low and hoarse. "Don't move," he hissed. "We don't want to hurt you." The plural made my stomach twist. He dragged me back inside, across the hall, his grip tightening as I struggled. But I bit down on his hand, hard enough to make him curse. He struck me. Not hard, but enough to stun, enough to remind me how fragile I was in this world of men who didn't play by the same rules as the rest of us. And then everything exploded. The first sound was glass, shattering somewhere down the corridor, followed by footsteps, too fast, too many. The man holding me stiffened, a curse dying on his tongue, and then, out of nowhere, a gunshot ripped through the air, deafening in its closeness. He went limp before I even understood what had happened, collapsing at my feet with a dull, sickening sound. I froze. For one heartbeat, two, maybe three. There was only silence again. The kind that comes right after violence, when the air hasn't decided what to do with itself yet. Then I saw him. Damien stood at the far end of the corridor, the gun still in his hand, his expression as calm as if he'd merely swatted away an inconvenience. The warm light caught the edge of his jaw, that familiar scar gleaming faintly. And for a moment I couldn't move, couldn't even think. He looked like something carved out of control and fire, beautiful, terrifying, completely unshaken. He took a slow step forward, then another, his voice breaking the silence in that same measured way of his. "Are you hurt?" I wanted to say no or yes or anything at all, but my throat wouldn't obey. My legs felt weak, my heart a drumbeat I couldn't silence. He reached me, holstered the gun with mechanical ease, and his hand came up. Not rough, not forceful, just the lightest touch against my cheek. "It's over," he murmured, his thumb brushing away a tear I hadn't realized had fallen. "He won't touch you again." I looked down at the body, the dark stain spreading beneath it, and something in me broke. Not in fear exactly, but in understanding. Because I realized then that this was who he was, that this was what came with him. Violence didn't orbit Damien Vasiliev. It answered to him. "What was that?" I finally whispered. He exhaled slowly, eyes flickering toward the lifeless man. "A message," he said. one I'll return with interest." The words were casual, but the promise in them was not. He led me away from the body, back toward the main hall, and though my hands were still trembling, I let him guide me. When we reached the staircase, I stopped, pulling my hand free, trying to catch my breath. "You killed him," I said, as though he might have forgotten. His gaze shifted back to me, steady, unrepentant. "He would have killed you. That doesn't make it—" I couldn't even finish the sentence. "Right?" he supplied softly. "No, it doesn't. But I don't deal in right or wrong, Lena. I deal in what's mine, and what I protect." Something in the way he said it made my skin heat, made my breath catch, because it wasn't a metaphor. It was a declaration, a claim. I hated that it didn't scare me as much as it should have. He turned away briefly, barking an order to one of his men who appeared as if from nowhere, and in that moment I saw the shift, the mask slipping just enough to reveal what lay beneath. He wasn't calm. He was furious. Controlled, yes, but furious. When he looked back at me, the fury was gone, buried again under that cold, unreadable exterior. "I told you not to wander alone," he said, his tone low, quiet, but sharp enough to draw blood. "I wasn't—" He cut me off with a look. "You don't understand yet," he said, taking a step closer, the air between us crackling. "The moment you stepped into my world, you stopped being invisible. You became a target. They see you as a way to get to me." "Then why bring me here at all?" I snapped, anger flaring through the fear. He smiled then, slow, sad, almost tender. "Because I wanted to," he said simply. "And because I never let anyone take what's mine." He reached out again, his hand sliding to the back of my neck, fingers warm against my skin. It wasn't a threat, but it wasn't comfort either. It was something in between, something darker. "You'll stay here tonight," he said softly, his breath brushing my ear. "No more wandering, no more pretending this is a game." I wanted to argue, but the words died before they reached my lips. When he finally stepped back, his eyes lingered on me one heartbeat too long, and in that gaze I saw everything I should have feared. Possession, violence, devotion, and yet, beneath it all, something almost gentle. Something that made me ache in ways I didn't understand. That night, as I lay in the room he'd given me, staring at the faint reflection of moonlight against the window, I thought about the body on the floor, the sound of the gunshot, the calm in Damien's voice as he said my name, and I knew, with a kind of terrible clarity, that I wasn't just inside his world anymore. I was inside him, caught between the darkness he commanded and the fragile light he offered me like a secret. I should have been terrified. Instead, I found myself whispering his name into the quiet, as if saying it aloud would make me understand why the danger didn't feel like destruction. It felt like destiny. And somewhere beyond the silence, in the deep hours of the night, I could swear I heard him answer, soft, distant, promising, "You're safe now, Malenkaya Ptichka. For tonight." I woke to the kind of silence that doesn't belong to morning, the kind that feels thick, deliberate, and almost watchful, as if the air itself has decided to hold its breath, waiting to see what you'll do next. For a long moment I didn't move. The room was dim, the curtains drawn against the early light, the sheets too soft and too expensive to feel real, and the faint scent of something masculine lingered there, cedar and smoke again, threaded with the quiet trace of his presence. For a few seconds I let myself believe that maybe the events of the night before had been nothing but a dream, that there hadn't been blood on the marble floors or a body cooling in the shadows, that I hadn't seen Damien Vasilyev kill a man without hesitation, his face as composed as if he'd merely turned off a light. But dreams don't leave marks on your reality, and when I shifted beneath the covers, I saw it. The faint bruise along my wrist where the intruder had grabbed me, already darkening like a reminder that my life had changed in ways I couldn't undo. I rose slowly, wrapping the robe someone, one of his staff perhaps, had left folded at the foot of the bed, and walked to the window. Beyond the heavy curtains, the world was washed in silver dawn, the gardens below glistening with dew, the air still carrying that strange stillness that always follows violence, as if nature itself knows how to wait respectfully after death. For a moment, I wondered what he was doing. If he'd slept. If men like him ever slept. Or if their minds stayed awake long after their bodies had closed their eyes. When I finally stepped out of the room, I half expected the house to be empty. But it wasn't. It was alive. Not with noise, but with movement. Quiet. Efficient. Purposeful. Men in dark suits moving through the halls like whispers, eyes alert but never lingering on me too long. I could feel the weight of their awareness, though. The subtle shift in posture, the flicker of curiosity. They knew who I was, or at least what I was to him, even if I didn't. In the dining room, breakfast had been set. A spread too lavish for one person, steam rising from porcelain cups, sunlight cutting across crystal glass. And at the far end of the table sat Damien, reading a file, sleeves rolled to his forearms, his hair slightly tousled, the faintest shadow of stubble along his jaw. It was unfair how composed he looked, how utterly untouched by the chaos of the night, before, as though control itself was his most natural state of being. When he looked up and saw me, something in his expression softened, though only slightly, the way an iceberg might shift without melting. "You should eat," he said, his voice low, smooth, a command disguised as kindness. "You didn't have much of an appetite last night." "I watched you shoot someone," I said, before I could stop myself. He didn't flinch, didn't deny it. "And you're still here," he replied, eyes holding mine. There was no arrogance in the way he said it, only quiet certainty, as if he knew that whatever line I thought I'd drawn between fear and fascination had already been erased. I sat down at the table opposite him, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for a glass of water. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He closed the file in front of him, leaned back in his chair, and studied me for a long moment. "Now," he said, "you stop pretending this is temporary. You have 7 days, a week to see what you asked for. My world as it is, not the stories, not the rumors, but the truth." I wanted to ask what that meant, but he continued before I could. "You'll stay here. You'll come with me when I say, and you'll listen when I tell you to. You'll see things that will make you want to run. And maybe, if you're smart, you will. But I don't think you will, Lena." "Why?" He smiled, not cruelly, not kindly, just with the kind of calm that comes from knowing how people break. "Because you want to understand me. And once someone wants that, they never really leave." I should have protested, should have reminded him that I wasn't one of his people, that I didn't belong in this place of velvet shadows and whispered commands. But instead I felt my pulse quicken, betraying me. There was something intoxicating about the way he spoke, the way he folded danger into intimacy, as if he were inviting me into a secret he had never shared before. He gestured toward the food, and I forced myself to eat, though every bite tasted of nerves and anticipation. He spoke little while I did, occasionally glancing at his phone or murmuring instructions to one of his men who appeared soundlessly beside him. When I finished, he stood, offering me his hand. "Come," he said. "It's time to begin." The day unfolded like a fever dream. I followed him through the maze of his empire, each step revealing another layer of the man behind the mask. We visited a warehouse by the docks, where men greeted him with bowed heads and murmured, "Boss," like a prayer. I watched as he spoke in Russian to a group of men, whose eyes darted toward me with curiosity they quickly hid. His tone was calm but final, the kind of voice that could stop a heart without raising in volume. I didn't understand all the words, but I understood power when I saw it. Not the loud kind that demands attention, but the quiet kind that doesn't need to. Everywhere we went, people deferred to him. Guards, businessmen, even strangers on the street who didn't know his name but recognized the gravity in his presence. It was terrifying and magnetic all at once. And I realized something I hadn't before. Damien wasn't just feared. He was revered. And that kind of reverence doesn't come from cruelty alone. It comes from control, from the promise that his word, once given, is unbreakable, even if it's soaked in blood. By evening, we were back at the mansion, the sky bruised with sunset. He poured 2 glasses of wine and handed me one, the color deep as garnet under the light. "You've seen what I am," he said, his gaze unreadable. "Now tell me what you think." I took a slow sip, the taste rich, heavy, dangerously sweet. "I think," I began, choosing my words carefully, "that you live in a world built on fear, and that you've convinced yourself that it's loyalty." His eyes flickered, just for a moment, and I thought I'd gone too far. But then he smiled, that same slow, knowing curve that always felt like a test. "Maybe you're right," he said. "But fear keeps people alive. Loyalty doesn't." He leaned closer, his voice lowering. "You've been inside my world for 1 day, and already it's inside you. You'll tell yourself it's fascination, curiosity, pity, but it isn't. It's hunger, the same kind that drives me." His words settled over me like smoke, seeping into every breath. "And what if I don't want to become like you?" I whispered. He brushed a strand of hair from my face, his fingers grazing my jaw with unbearable gentleness. "You already are," he said. There was no defiance left in me after that, only silence and the pounding of my own heart. When he finally stood, setting his glass aside, he said quietly, "Tomorrow, I'll show you the other side, the part they don't write about. If you still want to stay after that, you'll stop being a guest." "What will I be then?" I asked. His gaze caught mine, steady, unyielding. "Mine," he said simply. That night I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, my thoughts too loud. I replayed every word, every look, every impossible promise he'd made without speaking. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear, beneath the reason, I knew I wouldn't leave. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible. And though I didn't know what it would cost me, I couldn't walk away from the man who saw me and decided I was worth the danger. Not anymore. There are moments in a person's life that don't feel like they belong to time. Moments that hover between what was and what will be. Suspended in that fragile stillness where truth finally decides to show its face. The night Damien told me his story felt like that. Like standing on the edge of something vast and irreversible, knowing that once I stepped forward, I'd never be able to look at him, or myself, the same way again. It had rained earlier that evening, a slow, steady rain that made the world outside blur into water and glass, the kind of weather that always makes you introspective, makes you think about how fragile everything really is. The mansion was quieter than usual, the staff dismissed early, the guards stationed somewhere beyond sight, and I found myself sitting in the library, wrapped in the scent of old books and smoke, a glass of red wine untouched on the table beside me. I had come there to be alone, or at least that's what I told myself. But I think I knew he would find me. He always did. When he appeared at the doorway, he didn't announce himself, didn't make a sound, just stood there for a moment, watching me the way he always did, like he was trying to read something written on my skin. The firelight caught the edge of his face, casting one side in gold and the other in shadow. And for a heartbeat, I thought that was the perfect metaphor for him. Half light, half darkness, both too real to ignore. "You're hiding," he said finally, his voice low, almost gentle. "I'm thinking," I replied, though I suppose the two weren't that different. He came closer, each step measured, deliberate, until he stood near enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off him. "You've been quiet all day," he said. "I don't like it when you disappear into yourself." "I'm just trying to understand you," I said, and it was the truth. But every time I think I do, something happens that reminds me I don't know anything at all. His gaze softened then, and he sat across from me, his posture relaxed but his eyes never leaving mine. "Most people don't want to understand me," he said after a moment. "They just want to survive me." "That's not what I want," I whispered, and I didn't even realize how true it was until I heard myself say it. He studied me for a long time, his expression unreadable, then leaned back, exhaling slowly as if making a decision. "There are things I've never told anyone," he said. "Things that don't belong in this world, but they live in me anyway. You wanted the truth. Tonight I'll give you part of it." I nodded, not trusting my voice. He looked into the fire, and when he began to speak, his tone changed, still calm, but quieter, heavier, as though each word was being pulled from somewhere deep inside him. "I wasn't supposed to inherit any of this," he said. "The family, the business, the name. That was supposed to be my brother's. Alexander. He was older, smarter, better at pretending to be good. My father loved him, or what passed for love in our house. And I was just the one who watched, who learned how to disappear in plain sight." He paused, his jaw tightening, eyes fixed on the flames. "But when our father died, everything unraveled. Alexander took control, but power, it changes people. He made alliances with men he shouldn't have trusted, cut deals that broke the family apart. I tried to stop him, tried to warn him, but he wouldn't listen. He said I was jealous, that I didn't understand what it meant to lead." His hand tightened around his glass, the knuckles white. "He betrayed us. He sold names, safe houses, roots, things that could never be undone. Dozens died because of him. And when I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He said he did it for freedom, that he was tired of living in blood and rules. So I gave him what he wanted." I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I asked, softly, "What did you do?" His eyes met mine then, sharp and unflinching. "I killed him." The words landed like a knife, not sudden, but inevitable, like a truth I had always known was coming. He said it without hesitation, without apology, but not without pain. There was no pride in it, no triumph, just that hollow kind of honesty that only lives where love and hate have burned each other out. "He begged me not to," he continued, "not for his life, but for his son's. He had a boy, Mikhail, 8 years old. He asked me to protect him, so I did. I sent him away, to another country, gave him a new name, new life. He doesn't know who I am now. He can't. That's the only good thing I've done that still matters." For a while, neither of us spoke. The fire crackled softly, the rain whispered against the glass, and I could feel the weight of what he'd just told me settling between us like a living thing. "You want to know why I am the way I am?" he said finally, his voice quieter now, almost weary. "Because every time I close my eyes, I see his face. Not my brother's, the boy's. I see what he lost, what I destroyed, and I know that no amount of power, no empire, no blood can make it right." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "Does anyone else know?" He shook his head. "No one dares to ask." The firelight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. Not danger, not dominance, but a kind of fragility he tried to bury beneath layers of control. And it did something to me, something dangerous. Because pity, when mixed with desire, becomes something too close to devotion. and devotion in the wrong hands can ruin a person. Without thinking, I reached across the space between us and touched his hand. He didn't move, didn't pull away, but I felt the faint tremor beneath his skin, the tension of someone unused to being touched without expectation. "Damien," I whispered, and the sound of his name in that quiet room felt like a confession. "You don't have to carry it alone." He looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw the man beneath the myth. The boy who had learned too young that love and power don't coexist. He leaned closer, his voice low, almost a warning. "Be careful what you offer, Lena. My world doesn't forgive kindness. It devours it." "I'm not afraid," I said, though my voice trembled. He smiled then, not with amusement, but with something that felt like surrender. "You should be," he murmured, "because when you stop being afraid of me, that's when I become truly dangerous." The fire hissed softly, and for a moment time seemed to blur again. He reached out, his fingers brushing a tear from my cheek, then lingered at my jaw, tracing a path that burned even after he pulled away. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, though he made no move to send me away. "Every moment you stay, it gets harder for me to let you go." "Then don't," I said before I could stop myself. Something flickered in his eyes then. Pain, desire, warning. And in that fragile silence, the space between us disappeared. His lips found mine, not gently, not cruelly, but with the inevitability of gravity pulling two worlds together. The kiss was both a promise and a threat, fire and ice, and when he pulled away, his voice was barely a whisper. "This is why I don't tell people my past," he said, "because once they see the truth, they either run or they fall." I looked at him, my pulse wild, my heart breaking in ways I didn't yet understand. "And which one am I?" He exhaled slowly, his eyes dark and unreadable. "I don't know," he said, "but either way, you won't escape unscarred." And as the fire burned low, painting his face in shifting gold and shadow, I realized he wasn't just confessing to me. He was warning me. And I was too far gone to listen. I should have known that peace was never meant to last here. Not in Damien's world. Not in the place where every breath carried the echo of danger, and every silence felt like the calm before something inevitable. Something cruel. Something that would tear through the illusion I had built to keep myself from falling apart. The night after his confession, after the fire and the kiss that felt like a breaking point rather than a beginning, I couldn't sleep. His words looped through my head, soft as they'd been, that warning cloaked in tenderness. "You won't escape unscarred." And I realized that maybe I hadn't wanted to escape at all. He had given me glimpses of himself, the kind of raw truth most people would never earn, and it made me feel dangerous too, as if knowing his story somehow bound me to it. Like every secret he shared, tied another invisible thread between us. But intimacy in his world was a luxury that always came with a price, and when the bill came due, I wasn't ready for it. Not in the way I should have been. It began quietly, as betrayals often do, with something so small it almost seemed meaningless. A phone call he took in another room, his voice low and sharp, his tone colder than I had ever heard it. He didn't see me standing near the door, didn't see how the sound of his voice made my heart beat too fast, how I strained to catch fragments of words that meant nothing and everything all at once. "Shipment. Mikhail, clean it up before Friday." I told myself it wasn't my place to ask, that whatever his world demanded of him wasn't meant for mine. But curiosity is a hunger that doesn't starve easily. And the part of me that had begun to crave understanding couldn't stay silent for long. When he returned, his expression was unreadable again, that perfect mask of composure firmly in place. But his eyes, those cold, intelligent eyes that had learned how to keep the world at bay, looked tired, shadowed by something he didn't want me to see. "You're awake," he said simply. And I nodded, though the truth was I hadn't really slept since the night I first saw him pull the trigger. "I heard you on the phone," I said softly, not accusing, just searching. "You sounded angry." He studied me for a long moment, the silence between us stretching like a tightrope. "I'm always angry," he said finally. "It's the only thing that keeps me sharp." He brushed past me after that, and though his hand briefly touched my arm in passing, that familiar, grounding warmth that always made me forget how dangerous he was, the distance between us felt wider than ever. The next day, things shifted. People around the house began moving differently, faster, quieter. I noticed extra guards at the gates, men whispering in corners, the faint smell of gun oil clinging to the air. Damien was gone most of the day, his absence like a void that made every sound too loud, every moment too fragile. When he finally returned, it was late, and there was blood on his collar, faint but undeniable. He didn't explain it, and I didn't ask, though the silence that followed said more than words ever could. That night, when I finally fell asleep, it was to the sound of rain against the window and the steady rhythm of footsteps outside my door. His men keeping watch, or so I thought. But sometime before dawn, the sound changed. Heavier, faster, unfamiliar. I woke to it immediately, that primal instinct that tells you when something is wrong. I sat up, my heart pounding, just as the door creaked open. "Lena." It wasn't Damien. It was one of the guards, young, tense, eyes darting toward the hall. "You need to come with me," he said, his voice low but urgent. "What's happening?" I whispered. He hesitated. "We've been compromised. He doesn't want you here when—" The sound of gunfire cut him off, sudden and close, shattering the fragile illusion of safety, like glass breaking in the dark. He grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the back exit, and before I could even think, we were running, down the marble corridor, past portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow us, through doors that slammed shut behind us with echoing finality. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and panic, the world collapsing into chaos. "Where is he?" I gasped as we reached the courtyard, the cold air hitting my skin like a slap. "Inside," the guard said, fumbling for his radio. "He said to get you out now." But before he could speak again, another shot rang out, closer this time. He fell, his body twisting mid-step, and I screamed, dropping beside him, the world spinning in colorless streaks of light and sound. His blood was warm against my hands, and for a moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then I heard it, that voice, cutting through the chaos, dark and commanding and terrible in its calm. "Lena." I turned, and there he was. Damien, moving through the smoke like something summoned from the inferno, his gun steady, his eyes wild in a way I'd never seen before. He reached me in seconds, grabbing my face with one hand, scanning me for wounds. "Are you hurt?" I shook my head, though my body trembled. "What's happening?" "An ambush," he said, the word cold and efficient. "Inside help. Someone close." "Inside help?" I repeated, and even before he looked away, I knew. The truth had been waiting there all along, hidden in the shadows I'd refused to see. It was my phone. It had been missing since the day before, though I'd assumed I'd misplaced it somewhere in the house. But now, as he pulled a small black device from his pocket, mine, and showed me the tiny tracker attached to the back, I felt the floor tilt beneath me. "They used you to get in," he said quietly, almost tenderly, but there was steel beneath it, a restrained fury that could burn through walls. "They were watching through you." My throat went dry. "I didn't know—" "I know you didn't," he said, cutting me off, his voice sharp, but his eyes, God, his eyes, were something else entirely. Not accusation, not pity, but something that looked too much like pain. But that doesn't change what they've done. He turned then, barking orders to his men, his words in Russian, harsh and fast. Within minutes, the courtyard was crawling with his people, the air alive with noise and motion. He took my hand, pulling me toward the car waiting near the gate, the engine already running. "We're leaving," he said. "Now." The drive felt endless, headlights slicing through the wet dark, the world reduced to the sound of rain and tires and the low hum of his anger beside me. He didn't speak for a long time, and when he finally did, his voice was low, dangerous. "They came for me. But they used you to find me. Do you understand what that means?" I did, and the realization hollowed me out. "I put you in danger," I whispered, my voice breaking. He looked at me then, and the expression on his face was something I would never forget. Not fury, not disappointment, but a kind of fierce, desperate protectiveness that made my chest ache. "No," he said. "I did. Because I wanted you close. Because I wanted something I shouldn't have." I turned away, tears burning hot at the corners of my eyes. Then maybe I should have never come. He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe, but it's too late now." We drove through the night until the city disappeared behind us, replaced by empty fields and the dark stretch of forest beyond. When we finally stopped, it was at a safe house. Small, remote, the kind of place that existed only for people who needed to vanish. He got out first, then turned back to me, his expression unreadable again. "You'll stay here until I say it's safe," he said. "And you?" I asked. He hesitated, then leaned in close, his breath warm against my ear. "I'm going to find out who sold us out," he said softly. "And when I do, I'll make them remember what happens when someone touches what's mine." The words should have terrified me. Instead, they made my pulse race with something far more complicated than fear. When he left, the silence of the house pressed against me, heavy and unfamiliar. And for the first time since meeting him, I realized what it felt like to be truly alone. But even in that silence, I could still hear his voice, low, haunting, and possessive, whispering like a promise I couldn't unhear. "They wanted you to be the bait, Lena. They didn't know they'd turned you into the reason I'll burn them all." There is a certain stillness that comes after chaos, a kind of hollow quiet that hums through the air like the echo of something you can't quite name. And in that silence, I began to understand that the world I had willingly stepped into would never again resemble the one I'd left behind. The safe house Damien had brought me to was hidden deep within the woods, a relic of brick and shadows surrounded by trees so tall they blotted out the sky. And though it was meant to protect me, it felt instead like a cage. Too quiet, too remote, too filled with the ghosts of everything I'd seen and done since the night he first looked at me across that restaurant. Days passed, though time didn't move the way it used to. It stretched and folded in strange ways, marked only by the fading of light and the occasional voice on the radio. His men came and went, silent and efficient, delivering updates they never shared with me, carrying out orders they never explained. They were polite, respectful even, but there was an invisible wall between us, a reminder that I was not one of them, that I was something softer, foreign, an unpredictable variable in the life of a man who controlled everything else. And Damien, he was gone more than he was here. He'd disappear for hours, sometimes days, returning with the scent of rain and gunpowder clinging to his clothes, his hands sometimes cut, his eyes always a little darker than before. I asked him once what he did while he was gone, and he looked at me for a long time before answering, "I do what I must." It wasn't an explanation, but I understood it was all he could give. At night, I'd lie awake listening for the sound of his footsteps, that slow, steady rhythm that had somehow become my heartbeat. Sometimes he would come to me, silent, his presence filling the room before his voice did. He'd touch my hair, my throat, the edge of my jaw with a tenderness that didn't belong to the man who commanded fear like an army. And when he kissed me, it wasn't gentle but desperate, as if trying to erase the spaces between us before the world pulled them open again. And yet, for every moment of intimacy, there was distance, a shadow in his eyes that told me he was somewhere else even when he was beside me. I didn't know if it was guilt or rage or something darker, but I could feel it bleeding into him, hollowing him out from the inside. The first time I saw him come back with blood on his hands, real blood, not imagined or forgotten in the dark, I froze. He didn't look at me when he walked in, didn't speak. He just went straight to the sink, running the water until it turned red, then pink, then clear again. His face was unreadable, carved from silence, but his eyes burned with something feral. I moved toward him, though every instinct told me to stay back. "What happened?" I asked quietly, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. He just stared at the water circling the drain, his jaw tight. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low I almost didn't hear it. "They hurt one of my men," he said. "They wanted to send a message." I waited, heart pounding. "And you sent one back?" He turned to me then, his expression still, his gaze cold. "I always send one back." There was no remorse in his tone, no hesitation, but there was something else beneath it, something heavy and haunted. I wanted to ask if he'd killed them, if he'd looked them in the eyes while he did it, but I already knew the answer. I'd seen what he was capable of. I'd seen the part of him that could end a life as easily as breathing. And yet, standing there in that dim kitchen, watching the faint tremor in his fingers as he dried his hands, I realized I didn't fear him. I feared what losing him would do to me. Because somehow, impossibly, I loved him. It wasn't the kind of love people wrote about in soft novels or whispered about under summer stars. It was something far darker. A love born of danger, of fascination, of the terrible recognition that we were both too broken to exist in the light. He was my ruin, and I was his reprieve, and I didn't know which of us would destroy the other first. That night, he told me not to wait up for him. He kissed my forehead, a rare, fragile gesture that broke something inside me, and left without saying where he was going. I watched from the window as the car disappeared into the trees, its taillights glowing like dying embers until the darkness swallowed them whole. The storm came not long after, thunder rolling low and steady, rain slashing against the glass in sheets. I tried to distract myself with the fire, with the faint hum of the generator, but the air felt charged, tense, like the world itself was holding its breath. Hours passed, and still he didn't return. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember is the sharp crack of gunfire in the distance. Not one shot, but several, each one pulling me upright, heart slamming against my ribs. I stumbled to the window, peering through the rain. But the forest beyond was nothing but darkness and flashes of light where the trees split open with sound. The guards shouted somewhere outside, their voices blending into the storm. Then, silence. I grabbed the small pistol Damien had left in the drawer beside the bed. A precaution, he'd said, though I had never wanted to use it, and crept toward the door. The house was darker than it should have been, the generator dead, the air heavy with smoke and fear. I could hear footsteps outside, quick, uneven, too many of them. When the door burst open, I almost screamed, but it wasn't him. It was one of his men, soaked and pale, his face bloodied. "We have to go," he gasped. "They found us." "Where's Damien?" He hesitated. Too long. "Where is he?" I demanded, my voice breaking. He's still out there," he said. "He told us to get you out." The words barely made sense. I shook my head. I'm not leaving without him. Before he could argue, another explosion ripped through the night, closer this time, shaking the walls. The lights flickered once and died completely. I could smell fire now. Wood, gasoline, destruction. I ran. Past the hall, down the narrow corridor that led to the back door, out into the rain that hit my skin like ice. The air was alive with smoke and gunfire, flashes of light cutting through the dark. I could see shapes moving in the trees. Men, shouts, chaos. And then, through the blur of rain and flame, I saw him. Damien stood in the clearing, his coat torn, his face streaked with blood and water, gun raised in one hand, fury burning in every line of his body. He moved like something unstoppable, like vengeance given form. And even in that madness, my heart recognized him instantly. "Damien!" I screamed, my voice lost to the storm. He turned, just as another man stepped out from behind the trees, gun aimed at his back. I didn't think. I ran. The shot rang out, sharp and final, and for a moment I didn't know who it hit, only that the world went suddenly very still. Damien staggered, his eyes wide, his body folding in slow motion, and I reached him just as he fell, catching him in my arms, the rain washing over both of us like baptism and burial all at once. His blood was warm against my hands, and his breath came shallow, ragged. "Lena," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Don't—" But he didn't finish. His eyes fluttered, and for one terrible second I thought he was gone. I pressed my forehead to his, my tears mixing with the rain. "Don't you dare leave me," I whispered. "Not now, not like this." Somewhere in the distance, more voices shouted, friend or enemy, I couldn't tell. But I didn't move. All I could see was him, pale and still, the man who had saved me and ruined me all at once. And then, faintly, impossibly, his hand tightened around mine. "Go," he breathed, barely a sound. "They'll come for you next." "I'm not leaving you," I said, my voice breaking completely. His lips curved in the faintest ghost of a smile. "Then you'll die with me." The rain poured harder, the fire spread, and somewhere deep inside, something shattered. And as the darkness closed around us, I knew the choice I made next. To stay, to run, to fight, would decide whether this story ended in tragedy or something far worse. The rain did not stop that night. Not even after the fire was out. Not even after the men had vanished into the trees like ghosts retreating from their own sins. And in that endless storm I learned what it meant to love someone who belonged to darkness. To hold a man whose life had been built on control and power, and see him, for once, completely undone. I remember the way Damien's blood felt on my hands, warm and slick and terrifyingly human. The way it mixed with the rain until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. As if the world itself was trying to wash away the violence that clung to us both. He was still breathing, barely, his chest rising and falling with a rhythm that felt too fragile to belong to him. And when I pressed my palm to the wound beneath his ribs, I could feel his pulse flutter weakly against my skin, stubborn, defiant, alive. The men who had attacked us were gone or dead. I didn't know, didn't care. But the air still crackled with the residue of gunfire and rage. I called his name again and again, desperate, half prayer, half demand, and finally his eyes opened, unfocused at first, then finding me in that storm with the kind of clarity that broke my heart. "Still here," he whispered, his voice so faint I had to lean close to hear it. "Always," I said, though I wasn't sure if it was a promise or a lie. The sound of engines roared somewhere in the distance. His men, I thought. The ones who had survived. And when they reached us, I barely noticed the hands that pulled us apart, the shouts, the blur of movement. I only remember his gaze, locked on mine even as they lifted him into the car, his lips moving silently around a word I already knew before I heard it. Stay. I did. Hours later, in a safe house I'd never seen before, smaller, colder, lit by the ghostly glow of dawn, I sat beside his bed while a doctor worked, in silence. There was so much blood. Too much. And yet somehow he clung to life with the same ruthless determination he brought to everything else. The doctor didn't ask who he was or who I was. Men like him didn't ask questions they weren't paid to. When it was over, when the bandages were clean and the worst of the bleeding stopped, he turned to me and said, "If he makes it through the night, he'll live. But he'll never be the same." I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I watched the slow rise and fall of his chest, the faint tremor in his fingers, the way his lips parted occasionally as if trying to speak in dreams. I thought of all the things he'd told me, the brother, the boy, the empire, the ghosts, and realized that every story he had shared was both confession and warning. He had never tried to make me love him. He had only tried to make me understand what loving him would cost. And I had paid it, willingly, recklessly, because some part of me had always known that I would rather live 1 week in his world than a lifetime in the safety of my own. By morning, the rain had stopped, and a pale, trembling light crept through the window. He stirred then, his eyes opening slowly, unfocused and glassy at first. I leaned closer, taking his hand. "You're safe," I whispered, though I wasn't sure it was true. He looked at me for a long time as if trying to remember where we were, and then his lips curved faintly. "I told you," he said, his voice rasping. "You should have run." "And I told you I wouldn't," I said, tears stinging my eyes. He smiled, that quiet, devastating smile that had undone me the first time I saw it. "You never do what you're told." "Not when it comes to you." Silence fell between us then, but it wasn't empty. It was full of everything we didn't need to say, the choices we couldn't undo, the things we'd done in the name of survival and something like love. When he finally spoke again, it was softer, almost hesitant. "You need to leave this place, Lena. When it's safe. Take whatever you want, whatever you need, start over." I shook my head. "Without you?" He exhaled, the sound almost a laugh. "With me, you'll never be free." I leaned closer, my voice trembling. "I don't want freedom. I want you." He closed his eyes for a moment, his hand tightening around mine. "You don't know what you're saying." "I do," I whispered. "For once, I do." For a long time, he said nothing, just lay there, his breathing slow and shallow. When he finally looked at me again, his eyes were softer than I'd ever seen them, stripped of power, stripped of control, just a man who'd finally stopped running from himself. "Do you remember?" he said quietly. "That night at the restaurant? The first time I saw you?" "Of course I do." "You were sitting there," he murmured, "in that red dress, looking like you'd already decided you didn't belong anywhere. I couldn't look away. You had $5 on the table like you were waiting for something to save you, and I thought, maybe I could be that. Maybe I could give you something better." "You did," I said, my voice breaking. "You gave me everything." He smiled faintly, though his eyes glistened with something that wasn't pain this time. "No, Lena, I gave you the truth, and that's the cruelest gift I know how to give." The day stretched on, slow and heavy, the air filled with that aching quiet that comes after too much has been said. His men came and went, murmuring updates in the hallway, their faces grim, their eyes avoiding mine. I knew something was wrong, that there was more he wasn't telling me, but I didn't press him. I think, deep down, I already knew. When night fell, he asked everyone to leave us alone. I sat beside him again, tracing the edge of his hand, memorizing every line, every scar. His voice was weaker now, but steady. If anything happens to me, he said softly, you go to Mikhail. Tell him I kept my promise. Tell him his father wasn't the villain they said he was. Nothing's going to happen, I said, but even as I said it, I could hear how fragile it sounded. He looked at me then, that old fire flickering one last time in his eyes. Lena, he whispered, do you believe in redemption? I hesitated. I believe in love. He smiled, barely. Then maybe they're the same thing. I don't know how much time passed after that. The clock on the wall stopped meaning anything. I remember the way his breathing slowed, how his fingers tightened once around mine and then relaxed, how the world seemed to hold still in that exact moment, as if it too was waiting to see what choice he would make, to stay or to let go. And when his eyes finally closed, it wasn't violent or sudden. It was quiet, peaceful, like the ending of a storm that had raged too long. I stayed there until the sky began to pale again, until the sun rose and spilled gold over the broken world outside, and I realized that the only sound left was my own heartbeat. It's been months since that night. I live by the sea now, far from the city, far from the noise. Sometimes I think I can still smell him in the salt air, that mix of smoke and rain and something unnameable that belonged only to him. I still have the card he gave me, black and silver, tucked inside a book I can't bring myself to finish. And sometimes, when the light hits just right, I pull that card out and set it beside a $5 bill, the one I never spent. And I remember the girl I was that night, the one who thought love could be safe. Now I know better. Love was never meant to save us. It was meant to undo us, to strip us bare until all that's left is the truth. And in the end, maybe that's what Damien gave me. Not a happy ending, but a forever written in scars and silence. A promise, whispered between two broken souls who found each other in the dark and refused to look away. Because even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear his voice, low and steady, the ghost of a man who taught me that some loves aren't meant to be survived. You're mine, Malinka Petichka, he once told me, and even if I'm gone, I'll still be the shadow that follows you home. And he was right. He always was.